Hey everybody, I want to welcome you back to another episode of Westminster Wednesday, where each week we are looking at one question from the Westminster Shorter Catechism and exploring its meaning and significance for our lives today. And in the previous two episodes, we've been talking about the topic of sin, and we've learned a couple of important things. In question 13, we learned that our first parents, Adam and Eve, did not continue in the state that they were created in, but they fell from that state by sinning against God. And then in the last episode, in question 14, we talked about the nature of sin, and we explored how sin is any lack of conformity to God's law or any transgression of God's law, which means that we can sin in two ways. We can sin by doing things that God forbids or by failing to do things that God commands. Well, in today's question, number 15, we are going to continue on this same topic of sin, but we're going to explore the nature of that very first sin that was committed by Adam and Eve way back in the Garden of Eden. So question 15 asks, what was the sin whereby our first parents fell from the estate in which they were created? And the answer is, the sin whereby our first parents fell from the estate in which they were created was their eating the forbidden fruit. Now, at first glance, this question might just seem utterly obvious and not very profound. It just says Adam and Eve sinned by eating the forbidden fruit. But what I want to explore here is why they ate the forbidden fruit, and kind of to get behind this and ask why they ate of the forbidden fruit and what this action reveals about their motivations. And I want to briefly mention three things. So first of all, by eating of the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve questioned God's goodness. When God told them not to eat of the forbidden fruit, he was giving that command for their good. He said, if you do this, you are going to die. But then Satan came along and he caused Adam and Eve to question God's goodness. He convinced them that God was holding something back from them. He said, if you eat of this fruit, surely you're not actually going to die, but you're going to become like God. And so he convinced them that God was keeping something back from them, and he caused them to question God's goodness. And this was the first thing that led to their sin. The second thing was, not only did they question God's goodness, but they rejected God's authority. The Bible tells us that since God created us, he also owns us. He alone has the right to tell us how to live our lives. In other words, his word and his law have authority over us. But by eating of the forbidden tree, Adam and Eve were rejecting that authority. Instead of following God's rules, they were choosing to live by their own rules. And that brings us to the third thing that they were doing. Not only by eating the forbidden fruit were they questioning God's goodness and rejecting his authority, but by eating of the forbidden fruit, they were also asserting their independence. Human beings were designed to live as dependent creatures. We were designed to live life that is dependent upon God. We are to be dependent upon him for everything, for life, for knowledge, for everything. And yet, by eating of the forbidden fruit, what Adam and Eve were doing was that they were asserting their independence from God. They were saying that they didn't need to rely upon him for all of these things, but that they could be completely autonomous and determine their own destiny. Essentially, instead of living life by God's rules and God's way, they were saying to God, our way, our rules, our life. And what I want you to see in this episode as we think about this question is that those same three things that Adam and Eve did when they ate from the forbidden fruit are the same three things that we are doing every single time we sin. Whenever we sin, we are questioning God's goodness. We are telling ourselves that God's law isn't really what's best for us, but that somehow by sinning, we can be happier or that we can have a better life if we go our own way. Secondly, whenever we sin, we are also rejecting God's authority. Instead of living a life that is obedient to his rules, we're choosing to follow our own rules. And thirdly, whenever we sin, we're not just questioning God's goodness and rejecting his authority, but we are also asserting our independence. Instead of living a life of dependence upon God, we're asserting our independence and our autonomy. We're choosing to go our own way and live by our own rules. And that's what makes sin so serious. Sin is not just a minor infraction that I commit, but it is a rejection of God's rule and God's authority over my life. And that's why our fundamental need is not just that we need to be saved from a few mistakes here and there, but that we need to be saved from rebellion against our Creator. We need to be saved from our hearts, which are fundamentally turned against God. And thankfully, as we'll see in future episodes, that is exactly what Jesus came to save us from.